My gavel fell with a final, decisive crack, bringing justice to courtroom 3B. But before the echo faded, a woman's voice ripped open a truth far more devastating. I had just sentenced the wrong man and set a killer free. The air in courtroom 3B was thick enough to chew, smelling faintly of stale coffee, old leather, and the metallic tang of fear. I remember the clock on the wall, a drab, institutional thing, ticking with an almost malicious slowness. It was 4:58 p.m. 2 minutes until I could finally leave this suffocating box and go home to pretend my life wasn't slowly dissolving into a pile of bad choices and worse luck. My name is Judge Arthur Vance. I've been on the bench for 18 years, presided over everything from petty theft to vehicular manslaughter, and I pride myself on one thing: impartiality. Justice, in my courtroom, wears no color, bears no rank. It is blind, absolute, and sometimes devastatingly final. The defendant seated before me, Mr. Elias Thorne, was currently staring at his cheap, ill-fitting suit jacket, as if it held the secrets of the universe. He was young, maybe 22, built like a defensive lineman, but carrying himself with the slumped weight of a man already broken. The charge was serious: aggravated assault stemming from a bar fight that had escalated violently. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him delivering the final, career-ending blow to the victim, a local fraternity pledge named Blake Harrington. Blake's parents were in the gallery, their faces etched with permanent grief, their eyes fixed on me, demanding retribution. I had gone through the motions, the ritualistic dismantling of the law. Mitigation presented by the public defender, highlighting Thorne's clean prior record, his employment history at a warehouse, the fact that he was the sole provider for his ailing grandmother. Aggravation presented by the DA, emphasizing the severity of the victim's injuries, a fractured orbital bone, permanent nerve damage, and the sheer senselessness of the drunken rage that sparked it all. I reviewed my notes, the final sentencing guidelines blurring slightly under the fluorescent lights. The recommendation from the pre-sentencing report leaned toward the mid-range, 5 years, with 2 suspended pending successful completion of probation and mandatory counseling. It was a fair sentence, leaning slightly leniently given the defendant's background, but justifiable because of the victim's life-altering injury. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing too loudly in the sudden silence of the gallery. "Mr. Thorne," I began, my voice resonant, trained to carry authority. "Do you have anything further to say before this court passes sentence?" Thorne looked up, his eyes, dark, deep-set, meeting mine for the first time. There was no defiance there, only a profound, weary acceptance. "No, Your Honor," he mumbled, his voice barely a rasp. "I messed up. I'm sorry for what I did." "Sorry doesn't mend broken bones, Mr. Thorne," I stated, the words automatic, honed by years of repetition. "The law demands accountability for actions taken in anger. This court has considered all mitigating and aggravating factors. The nature of this offense, coupled with the permanent damage inflicted upon the victim, requires a significant punitive measure to satisfy the demands of justice." I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the mahogany bench, feeling the familiar cold grain under my palms. This was the moment of truth, the moment the hammer falls. Therefore, Elias Thorne, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that you be committed to the custody of the State Department of Corrections for a period of 4 years. Execution of the final 18 months of that sentence is suspended on the condition that you successfully complete 5 years of supervised probation, attend all mandated anger management sessions, and pay full restitution for Mr. Harrington's medical bills, as determined by the civil judgment. The public defender nodded stiffly, perhaps relieved it wasn't the full 5 years. Blake Harrington's mother let out a small choked sob into her husband's shoulder. Justice done. I picked up my gavel, ready to bring the hammer down, to finalize the proceedings and close the chapter on Elias Thorne's freedom. "Clerk, please confirm the commitment order." The clerk, Ms. Davies, shuffled papers near the electronic docket system, her expression neutral. "Yes, Your Honor, we have the sentencing details logged for the dock intake." I brought the gavel down. Crack. A decisive sound that usually brings a wave of relief or fresh agony to the room, depending on which side you represent. This court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow." As the bailiffs moved to secure Mr. Thorne and lead him back to holding, a woman in the gallery, whom I hadn't paid much attention to, she was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, blending into the backdrop of concerned relatives, suddenly shot to her feet. She wasn't shouting, not yet. It was a controlled explosion. "Objection. Your Honor, that sentence is inadequate. Unacceptable." The sudden disruption caused immediate chaos. Bailiffs converged on her, but she held up a hand, her eyes locked onto me with a terrifying, focused intensity. Her face, which had been composed moments before, was now visibly draining of color, turning an alarming shade of grayish-white. "Madam, you must sit down immediately, or you will be held in contempt," I warned, already annoyed at the interruption to the finality of the adjournment. I looked at the bailiff nearest her. "Officer, escort this woman out." But she didn't move for the officers. Instead, she took 2 staggering steps toward the bar, gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white, and addressed me directly, her voice shaking with an emotion I couldn't immediately place. It sounded like raw terror mixed with incredulous disbelief. "Judge Vance," she whispered, the sound barely audible over the murmur of the gallery, but amplified tenfold by the silence that instantly fell, as everyone realized something momentous was happening. You don't understand who that is?" I frowned, adjusting my glasses, preparing my standard rebuke for procedural interference. "I understand perfectly well, madam. That is Elias Thorne, convicted of aggravated assault." She shook her head violently, tears finally beginning to track down her pristine makeup. She pointed a trembling finger directly at the defendant, who was being calmly escorted away by 2 deputies near the side exit. The exit that led directly to the secure holding area, bypassing the main public route. "No! No, Judge!" she choked out, her voice cracking, the veneer of control utterly shattered. "That is not Elias Thorne. That is Alexander Thorne. Your Honor, you have just sentenced the governor's son." The courtroom froze. It wasn't just a pause, it was a complete cessation of air. The bailiffs paused mid-motion, their hands hovering near the defendant's back. Ms. Davies dropped a sheaf of papers, the sound scattering across the polished linoleum floor like birdshot. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. I felt a cold, electric shock run from the tips of my fingers through the mahogany bench and settle like an anchor in my gut. Alexander Thorne, Governor Thorne's only child. I stared at the woman, who was now being gently restrained by a very bewildered Deputy Miller. Her frantic insistence resonated with a truth I desperately wanted to deny, but the way she looked, the sheer, unadulterated panic, was too compelling. I knew Alexander Thorne. Every judge in the state knew the governor's heir. Alexander was privileged, arrogant, and often found himself in minor scrapes. DUI here, a noise complaint there, but never anything this serious, never anything that made it past pre-trial diversion. I gripped the edges of the bench, my knuckles white, trying to force logic back into the void the woman had torn open. Elias Thorne, that was the name on the docket. Elias Thorne was the man who had stood before me for arraignment, for motions, for this entire grim sentencing hearing. The file was pristine. The paperwork was signed, sealed, and delivered by the DA's office. I looked down at the docket sheet in front of me, my own handwriting scrawled at the top. State v. Thorne, Elias. "Madam," I managed, my voice dangerously low, stripped of its judicial authority. "I suggest you calm yourself. The defendant identified himself as Elias Thorne at every stage of these proceedings." "He lied!" the woman screamed, pulling free from Deputy Miller's grasp and pointing again, this time directly at me, her eyes wide with accusation. "He's Alex. He switched places. He's been doing it for years, pulling stunts, but this is beyond anything. My God, Judge Vance, if you let him leave." Before she could finish, the side door, the secure exit the deputies had been using, was suddenly flung open from the outside, not by a guard, but by an imposing man in a dark suit I didn't recognize. He burst in, moving with the swift practiced speed of a Secret Service agent. Behind him, 2 uniformed Capitol Police officers flanked him, their faces grim. The man scanning the room ignored the chaos, the dropped papers, and the distraught woman. His eyes locked onto me. He walked directly to the bench, bypassing the flustered bailiffs, and slapped a thick, official-looking folder onto the wood, right next to my sentencing notes. "Judge Vance," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that brooked no argument. "I am Special Agent Reynolds from the Governor's Security Detail. We need to halt all proceedings regarding the defendant currently in custody, labeled Elias Thorne." "Agent," I said stiffly, nodding curtly. "This court has concluded sentencing. The defendant has been remanded. There's nothing to halt." Reynolds didn't blink. He opened the folder. Inside were glossy photos, driver's licenses, passports, mugshots. "Judge, 3 hours ago, the real Elias Thorne, a man with a history of petty theft and drug use, known associate of the Thorne family's landscaper, was released from county jail on a technicality. He was paid, heavily paid. We are investigating who authorized that release." Reynolds tapped one of the photos, a picture of a man who looked similar to the defendant, but softer, with less defined features. "The man you sentenced is Alexander Thorne, the governor's son. He orchestrated an identity swap to avoid the fallout from a catastrophic accident he caused weeks ago, an accident that resulted in the death of a young woman near the State University campus. The toxicology reports were suppressed, but we found the evidence. Alexander fled justice and arranged for this poor man, the real Elias Thorne, to take his fall." My blood ran colder than the air conditioning trying to fight the late afternoon heat. A death, not just an assault, a vehicular homicide covered up by an identity switch involving the governor's son. And I, Judge Arthur Vance, had just sent the wrong man, the sacrificial lamb, to prison for 4 years. "Where is Alexander now?" I managed to ask, my voice suddenly thin. Agent Reynolds didn't answer me directly. Instead, he pointed to the photograph of the man I had just sentenced. "That is the governor's son, Judge, and he is gone. The deputies escorted him out less than 60 seconds ago, through the secure holding exit, heading toward the parking structure. He's currently en route to a private airfield outside the city limits. If he boards that plane, he's untouchable." I sprang up, knocking my chair backward. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "The deputies! They must have been tipped off! They escorted him out!" Reynolds glanced toward the empty side door, his face a mask of controlled fury. "They were likely paid or coerced, Judge. But here is the problem. The moment that man, Alexander Thorne, crosses into interstate airspace, he is beyond the jurisdiction of this state's courts. We have maybe 10 minutes, Judge Vance. 10 minutes before he leaves this county. You need to issue an immediate warrant for his arrest for obstruction of justice and identity fraud, and you need to order the state police to intercept that vehicle heading to the airfield. Now." I looked at the gavel still resting on the bench. I had just condemned an innocent man and released a murderer. The woman in the navy suit was weeping openly now, but her earlier panic was replaced by a horrifying clarity. I had sworn an oath to uphold the law, and in the span of 5 minutes I had been used as the final, unwitting piece of machinery in a monumental cover-up orchestrated by the highest office in the state. "Agent Reynolds," I said, grabbing my pen, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "Give me the address of this airfield and the description of the vehicle. We have to move faster than the governor's reach." But as I reached for the phone to call the chief of police, my internal line rang. A secure, unmarked number I only ever answered in emergency sessions. I hesitated, my eyes darting between the ringing phone and the agent. The governor was calling. He knew I knew, and he was already moving to stop me. The ringing of the secure line seemed deafening, a shrill, insistent trumpet announcing the collapse of my judicial fortress. Agent Reynolds instinctively stepped back half a pace, his eyes narrowing, reading the silent battle on my face. He knew exactly who was calling, the man whose son I had inadvertently freed, the man who now commanded every law enforcement resource in the state, except perhaps the handful of officers loyal only to the Constitution. I took a deep, ragged breath, ignoring the phone for a critical second. "Agent, the vehicle description." "Now, I need specifics before I answer that call. If the governor is on the line, he's already prepared his narrative." Reynolds leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "It's a black Cadillac Escalade, tinted windows. Plates are likely false or government issue. They took the direct route onto the I-90 access road leading west toward Finley Field. It's 10 minutes away if they're driving fast. If you can get a hold of the State Patrol Command, Order them to initiate a hard stop, citing a capital fugitive warrant. I nodded, scribbling the details onto the back of the official warrant form Agent Reynolds had provided. A warrant for Alexander Thorne, charging him with felony identity theft, obstruction of justice, and, I added quickly, the word tasting like ash, manslaughter. I finally snatched the phone receiver before the call could go to voicemail, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Vance," I clipped out, leaning my head close to the mouthpiece. The voice on the other end was smooth, cultivated, utterly devoid of the panic that had consumed his wife in the gallery. It was the voice of supreme, unchallenged authority. "Arthur, a word of advice, my friend. Put the phone down, walk back to your seat, and sign the dismissal order for the identity fraud charge on Elias Thorne. He's just been located back in his cell, unharmed and frankly, terribly confused." The governor was lying. He was trying to buy time, to contain the damage before the press got wind of the chaos unfolding in my courtroom. The real Elias Thorne was in a holding cell, probably terrified, while his doppelganger, Alexander, was speeding toward freedom. "Governor," I said, fighting to keep my tone level, professional. "The court is in possession of irrefutable evidence that your son, Alexander Thorne, perpetrated an elaborate identity swap. He is currently fleeing the jurisdiction in a black Escalade, and I have issued a warrant for his immediate apprehension on charges, including manslaughter. I will not sign any dismissal." There was a pause on the line, a fraction of a second where I imagined the governor's jaw tightening miles away. When he spoke again, the silk had completely peeled away, revealing cold steel underneath. "You have made a catastrophic error in judgment, Arthur. One that you are now doubling down on with astonishing recklessness. You are a state employee. I can have your commission revoked before the sun sets tomorrow. You have exactly 60 seconds to comply with my request. Forget the warrant. Forget the agent standing next to you. If you do not, I promise you, you will spend the rest of your life explaining to the Bar Association why you thought you could put the governor's son behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, while ignoring the actual fugitive who just walked out of your courtroom. He was threatening me, using the supposed innocence of Elias Thorne as leverage. It was blatant, terrifying political pressure. Agent Reynolds was watching me, his hand resting near the service weapon holstered at his hip, clearly prepared to take control if I faltered. "Governor," I said, my voice regaining its old courtroom steel, the sound suddenly firm enough to crack glass. "The sanctity of this court transcends your political ambition. I have already contacted the State Patrol Command. They are mobilizing resources to intercept that vehicle. Your son will be apprehended." I slammed the phone down before he could reply. The silence that followed was electric. "Did you reach them?" Reynolds demanded, leaning over the bench. "I issued the stop order to the State Patrol Chief directly. They should be intercepting the I-90 access road any second now." I grabbed the warrant and spun toward the door. "We need to confirm that interception. We are going to the command center." As I started to move around the bench, Ms. Davies, the court clerk, who had been paralyzed near her desk, suddenly found her voice, her face stricken. "Judge Vance, wait!" she cried out, her eyes wide with terror as she stared not at me, but at the open door leading out of the secure area. "The State Patrol Chief just called back. He said there was a misunderstanding. He said he was just informed by the Governor's Chief of Staff that the I-90 access road is currently closed due to an emergency gas leak drill. He said the interception was aborted." My momentum halted instantly. A gas leak? On a major highway access road? At 5:05 p.m. on a Friday? It was an obvious, brazen lie, a smokescreen laid down by the governor's apparatus in the agonizing seconds after I'd hung up. If the State Patrol had aborted the stop, Alexander Thorne was still driving toward that private plane, and the only people who knew his exact path now were me, Agent Reynolds, and the people trying to protect him. Suddenly, the door leading back into the main courthouse hallway, the public entrance, swung open. It wasn't the bailiffs returning. It was the frantic woman in the navy suit, somehow having broken free of Deputy Miller again, running back toward the bench, her face contorted not with panic, but with a terrifying, desperate realization. "Stop!" she shrieked, stumbling into the center aisle, pointing wildly down the hallway I had assumed led to the secure parking garage. "It's not Finley Field," That was a diversion? I heard them talking on a secure line near the elevators when I ran out. They moved the plane. He's not going west. He's going to the federal hangar. They're using the diplomatic access route. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the remaining oxygen from the room. The federal hangar. That meant crossing jurisdictional lines instantly. If Alexander Thorne reached an aircraft secured under federal protection, my state warrant, even backed by Agent Reynolds' authority, would become a bureaucratic paperweight, while the governor made calls and grounded any pursuit. The federal hangar at Air Force Base 4. Agent Reynolds barked, slamming his hand on the desk. He was galvanized, no longer relying on procedure, but on pure, desperate action. That's a direct line onto military tarmac. Judge, we have to go. Now. I need you to authorize every resource I have access to immediately. My team has 2 unmarked vehicles staging downtown, but they need your direct judicial override to engage on federal property without prior clearance. I didn't hesitate. The image of Elias Thorne, the innocent man I had sentenced, sitting broken in a cell, while his wealthy counterpart slipped the leash of justice, fueled a resolve colder and harder than any I'd felt on the bench. This wasn't about abstract law anymore. It was about rectifying an appalling, direct injustice I had personally enabled. Agent Reynolds, I said, grabbing my judicial robe, the heavy black fabric suddenly feeling like armor. You have my full authorization. Use any means necessary to secure Alexander Thorne and bring him back to this courthouse. I will personally notify the Chief Judge and the Attorney General regarding the political interference and the identity swap. If the State Patrol is compromised, you and I are going to use whatever local authority I can muster to intercept him before he boards that plane. The woman in the Navy suit, who I now realize must have been Alexander's conscience, or perhaps a compromised co-conspirator who had a last-minute crisis of loyalty, was watching us, pale but resolute. I can give you specifics on the hangar access codes used for the Thorne family's private jet, she volunteered, stepping forward. I memorized them from the security briefings the First Lady made me sit through for a charity event. They'll be using Gate Charlie 7. It's the least monitored for private departures. Reynolds looked at her, a flicker of respect replacing his grim tension. You're coming with us. You're the key witness to the swap. We moved as a unit, the judge, the federal agent, and the woman who had just destroyed her own security, out of the courtroom and into the secured hallway. Miss Davies, the clerk, was already on the phone, her voice tight but professional, issuing a highly unusual, highly detailed alert about a capital fugitive being transported under escort. A necessary insurance policy should Reynolds' team fail. The next 15 minutes were a blur of adrenaline-fueled chaos. We piled into Reynolds' unmarked powerful sedan. He drove with a terrifying competence, weaving through the late-day traffic, the city streets becoming the racetrack for justice. I sat in the back, still wearing my robes, feeling absurdly formal for a high-speed chase, but unable to shed the mantle of my office. We're 2 minutes out from Base 4's perimeter, Reynolds reported, tapping frantically on a secure tablet displaying satellite imagery. The state police chief is refusing to commit resources to a local judge's unauthorized pursuit. He's stonewalling. Then we bypass them, I growled. As we approached the perimeter fence of Air Force Base 4, the sheer scale of the operation became clear. Reynolds' small team, 3 black SUVs materializing out of nowhere, met us near a utility access road just outside the main gate. They were tactical, efficient. Gate Charlie 7 is dead ahead, Reynolds confirmed, pointing toward a less conspicuous service entrance. Judge, if you give the direct command to our men to breach that gate under the pretense of protecting federal assets from imminent security threat, which, in essence, is what we are doing, it buys us the time we need before the base commander can raise hell. I looked at the uniformed men, their faces obscured by tactical gear. This was a genuine breach of federal property, an act that could end my career instantly, regardless of the motive. But then I pictured Elias Thorne, shackled, facing years away for a crime he didn't commit, while the true culprit planned his escape to a jurisdiction beyond our reach. I authorized the immediate breach of Gate Charlie 7 for the purpose of apprehending Alexander Thorne, charged with capital offenses under state law, I stated, loud enough for all the assembled tactical officers to hear. Proceed with extreme caution. Lethal force authorized only if the suspect attempts to board the aircraft. The response was immediate. The lead SUV didn't slow down. It slammed directly into the chain-link gate, tearing it from its moorings with a wrenching shriek of metal. Alarms blared instantly across the base. We roared onto the tarmac. And there it was, a sleek private Gulfstream jet, engines already spooling up to a deafening roar, ground crew scrambling back from the boarding stairs. And at the top of those stairs, framed against the harsh light of the jet's cabin, was Alexander Thorne. He looked back, momentarily stunned by the sudden eruption of black SUVs converging on his escape route. He saw me, seated stiffly in the back of the lead vehicle, still draped in my black judicial robes. He recognized the man who had unknowingly sentenced a patsy in his place. Alexander didn't run. He didn't panic. Instead, he raised a hand to his mouth, made a mock salute toward my position, and then, with a casual, arrogant smirk that seared itself into my memory, he turned and disappeared into the luxurious interior of the waiting jet. Reynolds slammed on the brakes 20 yards from the aircraft. Too late! The engines are at takeoff power. They're closing the doors. The ground crew scattered as the jet began its taxi toward the runway. Reynolds scrambled for his radio, screaming into it, demanding the tower shut down the runway. But the tower, operating under federal jurisdiction, likely already had orders from higher up. We watched, helpless, as the jet began to gather impossible speed down the main runway. It lifted off the ground with a smooth, undeniable surge of power, banking sharply into the darkening western sky. Free. I leaned back against the cool leather seat, the roar of the departing jet fading into a sickening, receding whine. I had failed to stop the fugitive. Alexander Thorne was gone. Agent Reynolds, however, was still staring at his tablet, his face a mask of cold calculation. He didn't seem defeated. He looked calculating. "Judge Vance," he said quietly, finally looking up at me, his eyes blazing with a new kind of intensity. "You did your part. You gave us the warrant, the authority, and the distraction. The governor moved fast, but he moved his assets to a federal location. That means we have a clear chain of evidence leading directly to the White House, not just the State House. And Judge?" He paused, tapping a single coordinate on the tablet. "Alexander Thorne may have reached the altitude, but he hasn't reached international airspace yet. And now that you've been publicly implicated in chasing him, the governor will focus all his energy on controlling the narrative here." Reynolds leaned closer, the scent of ozone and gunpowder lingering from the gate breach. "The governor thinks this is over. He thinks his son is safe. But he forgot one thing. You sentenced the wrong man. And the man you sentenced, the real Elias Thorne, is still in custody, and he's about to become the single most valuable witness in the country. We just bought ourselves a state trial on identity fraud and obstruction of justice, and we're going to use every single minute of Elias Thorne's mandatory 4-year sentence to build a case so airtight, Governor Thorne will be testifying against his own son by Christmas.